The work was slow. Every decision was weighed against decades of prejudice. A suggestion for a joint memorial was debated for weeks. The design of the exchange student uniforms became a point of contention. Some on both sides saw any compromise as a surrender. The old hatreds did not vanish with a signature. They lingered, a low background noise that threatened to drown out the new, fragile cooperation. Michael's presence was a constant reminder of what was possible. He was living proof that a human could be trusted with their most valued treasure. His commitment to the prince was visible in every interaction. It gave the Xenoan delegates a reference point. When they doubted human intentions, they could look at him. When the human delegates grew frustrated with Xenoan formality, he could explain its cultural roots. The personal bond provided a foundation of good faith that the bureaucratic process could build upon. The trust between two individuals was slowly, painfully becoming the trust between two civilizations. The seeds of a shared destiny were planted. Now they had to be tended. The Xenoan ship's observation terrace was a quiet space. The formal negotiations had concluded hours ago. The signed accord was a done thing. The immediate danger of the attack had been contained, the assailants in custody. A brittle calm had settled over the delegation. Michael stood with Eris, their backs to the politics and protocols. Before them, the stars filled the viewport, not the binary suns of the neutral meeting ground, but the deeper, colder field of the galaxy's arm. A silence hung between them, not of tension, but of shared exhaustion and the weight of what came next. The prince was the first to speak. His voice was quieter than usual, the formal Xenoan cadence softened by a child's genuine curiosity. He asked a final question. It was not about treaties or strategies. It was about the stars. He pointed a slender blue finger toward a cluster of distant lights. He wondered if the stars of Earth would ever feel as familiar to him as his own. He asked if he could ever look at a human constellation and feel the same sense of home it gave a human child. The question was simple. Its implications were vast. It spoke of future visits, of continued cooperation, of a longing that went beyond politics. It was the core of the entire mission, distilled into a single, poignant thought from a boy. Michael listened. He heard the hope and the uncertainty in the question. The peace they had built was a structure of words and promises. It was strong, but it was new. It would require constant work to maintain. It would face challenges from hardliners on both sides, from misunderstandings, from the sheer inertia of 20 years of hatred. The future was not guaranteed. It was a path they would have to walk every day. The prince's question touched the heart of that uncertainty. Could two peoples who had spent a generation trying to destroy each other ever truly share a sense of wonder? Could they ever see the same sky and feel the same belonging? Michael's reply was slow in coming. He chose his words with care as he had when he first tried to tell the boy a story. He framed their shared hope. He said he hoped both their peoples would come to see all stars as shared heritage, rather than divided territory. It was a vision of the future not as separate spheres of influence, but as a common ground. A universe where borders were not lines on a star chart, but concepts that had been outgrown. This was the core longing. It wasn't just an end to the shooting. It was the beginning of something more profound. A shared sense of wonder, a mutual curiosity that could replace mutual suspicion. The child's question had encapsulated the entire goal. It was about more than safety or commerce. It was about creating a reality where a Xenoan child could stand under a human sun and feel not like a visitor, but like he belonged. Where a human could look at a Xenoan nebula and see beauty, not a strategic vulnerability. It was about weaving their two histories into a single shared narrative. The attack in the hall had been an attempt to keep their destinies separate. This conversation on the terrace was the answer, a quiet affirmation that their futures were now intertwined. Michael looked down at the prince. The starlight reflected in the boy's large, dark eyes. He saw the same intelligence and perception that had seen past his uniform weeks ago. The child had built the first bridge with a simple request for a story. Now he was envisioning the destination, a place where the stars were just stars. Not human stars, not Xenoan stars. They're stars. The peace would be secured not by fleets or treaties alone, but by the ability of their children to look up and feel at home anywhere in the galaxy. The work ahead was immense, but the compass for that work was set. It pointed toward that shared stardom. The conversation ended there. No grand declarations were needed. The simple exchange under the alien sky was enough. It was a promise between them, unspoken but understood. The direction was set. The journey ended where the real work began. Michael stood by the airlock of the Xenoan diplomatic vessel, a single duffel at his feet. His home was now split between two worlds, his life divided between two loyalties. He looked back at the human delegation one last time. Their nods were respectful but distant. He was no longer entirely one of them. Ahead lay the jump to Xeno Prime, a world he had only ever seen through a gunship's targeting scope. The work ahead would be a slow, difficult grind. It would be fraught with old prejudices hiding behind new policies, with cultural misunderstandings waiting to ignite, with the constant, low hum of distrust from hardliners on both sides. The peace was signed. Now they had to build it. This foundation was not laid by treaties alone. It was built on a moment of personal trust between a soldier and a child. That single interaction became a model. It showed that empathy could be a more effective shield than the strongest armor. A formal treaty creates borders. A personal bond creates belonging. The alliance proved that true. Lasting peace requires an emotional investment. It demands a willingness to be vulnerable, to show your scars instead of hiding them. It asks you to trust before you are certain of the return. This was the core of it. Not a strategic calculation, but a human connection. Michael's own evolution was the blueprint for this change. He turned his personal loss, the memory of the silence after Tahiti, into the very motive force for a future without war. He did not forget the dead. He honored them by ensuring their sacrifice built something lasting. He channeled the energy of a warrior into the patience of a guardian. His journey from a soldier who defended borders to a father who protected a child mapped the path forward for both their civilizations. It was a radical shift in identity, and it asked the same of everyone else. The stars themselves were transformed by this new perspective. They were no longer a battleground to be contested, points of light to be claimed or denied. They became a shared canvas, a common heritage for both species to explore and wonder at together. The goal shifted from controlling territory to understanding it, from dominating the heavens to belonging to them. This was the ultimate victory. Not the defeat of an enemy, but the elimination of the very concept of enmity. The peace was secured for one simple reason. A warrior, when tested, chose to protect instead of fight. He chose a promise over a protocol. He valued a child's safety over his own life. That single decision, made in a split second under fire, did more to guarantee the future than any clause in the accord. It was an act of such pure, undeniable integrity that it silenced the arguments of cynics on both sides. It was proof that the new alliance was built on something real. This was not a neat conclusion. It was a messy, uncertain beginning. Michael's integration into Xenoan society would be watched with suspicion by many. The exchange programs would face setbacks. The shared history projects would reopen old wounds. The peace was a living thing. It would require constant care and feeding. It would need more people willing to make the same choice Michael did. To see the person behind the uniform, the potential friend behind the former foe. He took a final breath of the recycled station air. Then he turned his back on the familiar and stepped through the airlock onto the Xenoan ship. The corridor was all smooth, organic curves and soft ambient light. It smelled of ozone and an alien spice. It was not home, not yet, but it was where his duty lay. His duty to a boy and to the future that boy represented. The ship hummed around him, preparing for the jump to light speed. He thought of Eris, probably already in his quarters, eager to show him the constellations from his homeworld. He thought of the long, difficult work of building trust between their peoples. It would be a harder fight than any battle he'd commanded, but it was a fight for something instead of against something. That made all the difference. The stars outside the viewport began to streak into lines of light. The journey to Xeno Prime had begun. The foundation was set. Now they had to build the house. The most enduring alliances are never just ink on a page. They're forged in the space between individuals and a shared look, a kept promise. They're built by people, not policies. She stated it plainly. The attack, designed to shatter trust, had failed. It had instead forged that trust in the fire of crisis. It had provided undeniable proof of commitment. She looked toward Michael, where a medic was sealing the gash on his leg. His uniform jacket was open, the dark stain on his shirt visible. His actions were not those of a diplomat following orders. They were the actions of a guardian honoring a vow. He had proven his word with his blood. He became the living argument against the fear. A human soldier had placed his body between their royal family and death. What stronger guarantee of peace could there be? The crisis was no longer a reason to retreat. It was a reason to push forward with greater resolve. The shock of the attack had clarified everything. It had stripped away the diplomatic niceties and exposed the core of the matter. Both sides now saw the true enemy. It wasn't the other species. It was the specter of endless war, the bitterness that turns peace into a weakness. The Empress harnessed the momentum of the attack. She transformed a moment of hatred into a catalyst for a stronger, more determined alliance. The anger and fear in the room were channeled, redirected toward a common purpose. The Astralis Accord was no longer just a document. It was a shield against the chaos they had just witnessed. Signing it immediately in the shadow of the attack would be the most powerful rebuttal possible. It would tell the extremists they had lost. It would tell their own people that the future would not be built on fear. The Empress's resolve solidified the room. The advisors fell silent, their arguments for delay evaporating before her certainty. The medics finished their work. The security team stood at attention. The path was clear again. Not the safe path. The right one. The work would continue, not despite the attack, because of it. The medics sealed the gash on Michael's leg and patched the cut on his ribs. The wounds would heal. The deeper change would not. His position in the grand diplomatic play had dissolved. He was no longer just Earth's man on Aralis Prime. He was something else now, something that didn't fit on an organizational chart. His loyalties were visibly, irrevocably divided. He felt the split like a physical sensation. A new center of gravity had formed in his life, and it orbited a Xenoan child. Back on Earth, the analysis began. Secure channels between Earth Command and the diplomatic envoy lit up with encrypted traffic. They debated the new variable. Commander Michael Rains, Father Guardian to the Xenoan heir. Was he their greatest strategic asset or an unacceptable risk? His unprecedented access to the highest levels of Xenoan power was an intelligence coup beyond imagining. He could provide insights no spy ever could. He could influence policy from within the royal household itself, but the concern was equally profound. His primary duty was now to Prince Eris. That was the core of the Xenoan title. It was not an honorary designation. It was a legal and cultural bond that carried immense weight within their empire. His first loyalty was to the child's safety and well-being. Where did that leave his duty to Earth? If a conflict of interest arose, which side would he choose? The question hung over every assessment. They had a man in the room where decisions were made, but he was no longer entirely their man. This was the ultimate test of the fledgling peace. It asked a fundamental question. Could they trust a human, a former enemy commander with the heir to the Xenoan throne? The Empress had already answered yes. She had staked the future of her line on that trust. Earth Command now had to match that gamble, to see the potential instead of just the peril, to understand that this was not a loss of control but a new form of influence, one built on personal integrity rather than covert manipulation. Ambassador Ellis, the lead envoy, saw it clearly. He had watched the entire improbable sequence unfold, the child's approach, the story, the attack, the vow. He communicated his assessment back to command. He stated that Michael had become something more valuable than a strategist or a negotiator. He was a living symbol, a human who had earned the trust of the Xenoan royal family, not through tactics but through character. He was the embodiment of the peace they were trying to achieve. A bridge made of personal promise, not political parchment. His personal bond with the prince was no longer a sidebar to the negotiations. It was the foundation. Everything else would be built upon it. The trade agreements, the scientific exchanges, the military de-escalations, they would all rely on the stability of that initial connection. It was a fragile way to build an alliance, but a powerful one. It meant the peace was personal. Its success or failure hinged on the relationship between a weary soldier and a curious boy. Michael felt the weight of the dual roles. He attended strategy sessions with the Earth delegation, but his mind was also on the prince's daily lessons, his safety protocols, his quiet moments of doubt. He was integrated into the heart of Xenoan governance in a way no outsider had ever been. He was privy to casual remarks over meals, to the Empress's unguarded concerns, to the subtle dynamics of the court. He was an internal guardian, not an external observer. Earth Command's final analysis acknowledged the risk, but approved the new reality. They saw the strategic advantage was too significant to ignore. They would have a voice inside the most secure chamber of their former enemy's power structure. But they understood that voice would now speak with two accents. It would advocate for Earth's interests, but it would also protect a Zenoan child. The two objectives were now intertwined. The success of one guaranteed the success of the other. Michael's transformation was complete. The diplomat was gone. The Father Guardian remained. The Astralis Accord was a signed document, a collection of terms and articles that filled data slates. It marked the end of the war, but it was not the work. The work began the next day. The treaty outlined a future built on cultural exchange, shared scientific missions, and a permanent diplomatic corps. The words looked clean and simple on the screen. Implementing them required a substance that was scarce after 20 years of conflict. It required trust, the kind of trust that doesn't come from negotiations. It had to be built brick by brick across a chasm of mutual suspicion. The programs that emerged were not designed in distant government offices. They were born from the unique connection that had already formed. They were extensions of the trust between a soldier and a prince. Student exchange initiatives were drafted. The first groups would be small. Teenagers from Earth would live with Zenoan families. Zeno and Young would study in human academies. The selection criteria favored children of diplomats and soldiers. Those who understood the cost of failure, joint astrophysics missions were planned. Ships with mixed human and Zenoan crews would chart the gravitational anomalies in the Black Nebula. It was neutral territory, a place of scientific mystery, not military history. The mission parameters required crew members to share living quarters, to rely on each other for survival in a hostile environment. It was a controlled experiment in cooperation. The success of the mission would depend on the crew's ability to see each other as colleagues, not former enemies. Historical reconciliation projects were the most difficult. They involved opening archives, comparing battle records, acknowledging losses on both sides. The goal was not to assign blame, but to create a single shared history of the conflict, to understand how it started, how it escalated, and how to ensure it never happened again. These were not cold bureaucratic programs handed down from a committee. They were organic. They grew from the seed of a personal bond. They were a family's trust metastasizing into institutional change. Earth Command approved Michael's continued integration for clear strategic reasons. They saw the undeniable advantage of his position. He was not an outside observer reporting on the Zenoan court. He was inside it. He ate meals with the royal family. He attended the prince's lessons. He heard the informal conversations that happened before and after official meetings. His access was unprecedented. He could provide context, nuance, and early warning of potential conflicts that no intelligence report could ever capture. He was their best asset for ensuring the Accord's success. His role expanded beyond symbolism. The Zenoan implementation delegation invited him to join their working group. He was to travel with them to Zeno Prime itself. This was not a diplomatic visit. It was an integration. A human would now sit at the table where the future of the Zenoan Empire was being shaped. He would help draft the policies, review the proposals, and advise on the cultural sensitivities of the exchange programs. He was no longer just a guardian for the heir. He was an architect for the new alliance. His perspective was unique. He could interpret human motivations for the Zenoans and explain Zenoan customs to the humans. He understood the unspoken assumptions on both sides. He knew what a human engineer really meant when he said a timeline was optimistic. He knew what a Zenoan noble implied with a slight tilt of the head. He became the cultural translator for the entire implementation phase. His value was not in his authority, but in his understanding. Then he saw Aris. The boy stood beside his mother, his large eyes wide with a shock that wasn't fear yet. It was just confusion. The world had gone wrong in a second. Michael's mind didn't debate it. There was no calculation, no weighing of political outcomes. The promise he had made just hours before was not a piece of diplomacy. It was a vow. It lived in his muscles, not his mind. He moved. His body was a weapon turned to a shield. He put himself between the attackers and the royal family. His momentum carried the Empress and the Prince back, behind the solid bulk of the speaking podium. It was a fractional shift, but it broke the attacker's line of sight. It bought a second. His soldier's instincts took over. The diplomat vanished. The man from the Proxima Centauri campaigns was back. His eyes tracked the 5 figures. He assessed angles of approach, available cover, weapon types. His body remembered the weight of a rifle that wasn't there. He was unarmed, outnumbered. His only asset was position. He held it. The first attacker closed in. An energy discharge sizzled past Michael's head, scorching the wall behind him. The smell of ozone and burned stone filled the air. A second man came in low with the knife. The blade was meant for the Empress. Michael twisted, taking the strike on his ribs. The ceramic edge glanced off the reinforced weave of his formal jacket. It didn't cut deep, but the impact was a solid, painful punch to his side. He grunted, but his feet didn't move. A second shot followed. It wasn't aimed, it was panic fire. The blue energy beam grazed his leg. The pain was instant and sharp, a line of fire across his thigh. His leg buckled for a second, but he locked his knee. He stayed upright. He stayed between. The attackers were shouting now, cries of rage and fanatical slogans. They were trying to flank him, to get a clear shot at their real targets. He ignored the pain in his side and his leg. He ignored the shouts. His world narrowed to the space between the attackers and the podium. He was a barrier. That was his only function. Security forces were reacting now. Alarms blared. Xenoan guards in polished armor were moving, their own energy staffs humming to life. But they were seconds away. Michael was the first closest line of defense. He was a diplomat in a formal uniform, bleeding from 2 wounds, facing down 5 armed extremists. He had no weapon but his body and a promise. He had given his word. He would protect the boy. That was the core of it. The politics, the treaty, the future of 2 civilizations, it all distilled down to that single, simple duty. Stand between the threat and the child. Do not move. The extremists wanted to destroy the peace by killing its symbols. He would defend it with the same currency, his body for theirs. His position did not waver. The air filled with the sharp crack of energy discharges and the shouts of panicked delegates. Xenoan guards moved with disciplined speed, their energy staffs humming as they engaged the attackers. But Michael was the first barrier, the closest. He stood his ground before the podium, a fixed point in the chaos. He didn't have their training or their weapons. He had position and a promise. His side ached where the blade had struck. A warm, sticky wetness spread under his formal jacket. The burn on his leg sent a raw, electric pain up his nerve endings with every shift of his weight. He ignored it. His focus narrowed to a single point. Protect the family he had sworn to guard. The political mission, the strategic implications. Earth Command's directives. They were static, a distant hum. His world was the space between the attackers and the people behind him. That was all. He didn't shout a challenge. He didn't declare his loyalty to the crowd. His affirmation was internal, a quiet anchor in the storm. 3 words, spoken to himself. I gave my word. It was not a boast. It was a reaffirmation, a reminder of the core of this new bond. This was not about political strategy or interspecies diplomacy. It was about personal integrity, a vow made and kept, regardless of the cost. It was a force that overrode every other consideration. The human extremists understood their target. They were not aiming for maximum casualties. They aimed for maximum symbolism. Killing the Xenoan Empress and her heir at the moment of their alliance with humanity would be a wound that could never heal. It would prove their entire thesis. That trust between their species was a fantasy. That violence was the only true language. They wanted to shatter the peace by destroying its heart. They wanted to show that coexistence was impossible. Michael's actions became the perfect counter-argument. He was human. He was a decorated commander who had led the assault on their northern colonies. He was the embodiment of their enemy, and he was now using his own body as a shield to protect their royal family. He was proving the exact opposite of their hateful message. He was demonstrating that trust could exist, that a personal bond could transcend species, history, and war. He did not fight as a soldier for Earth. That part of him was gone. He didn't assess the threat for tactical advantage or strategic gain. He assessed it for one reason: to keep the boy safe. Every move, every blocked angle, every second he held his ground was for Eris. He was a guardian. That was his only identity now. The extremists were fighting for an ideology, for a political vision of perpetual conflict. He was fighting for a child. The motivations were not on the same scale. One was abstract. The other was absolute. The attackers failed because their calculations were incomplete. They could plot the security layout, forge credentials, time their assault for maximum psychological impact. They could calculate the angle of an energy blast and the trajectory of a knife strike. But they could not calculate the power of a personal promise. They could not factor in the stubborn, illogical commitment of one man to a vow he made hours before. They did not understand that a bond forged in trust could be a stronger shield than any armor. Their plan relied on predictable responses. They expected human self-preservation. They expected the Xenoan guards to protect their own. They did not expect a human to become the first, most dedicated line of defense for the people he was supposed to be negotiating with. Their failure was not in their planning or their weapons. It was in their inability to comprehend the thing they were trying to destroy. They wanted to prove trust was impossible. In trying to destroy it, they only made it stronger. Michael's blood on the polished floor, his unwavering stance, his silent commitment, these were the answers to their violence. Not more violence, but a deeper, quieter resolve. The attack was meant to end the peace. Instead, it cemented its first, most important building block, a promise kept under fire. Chaos settled over the hall like a fine dust. The sharp smell of discharged energy weapons mixed with the sterile scent of medkits. Medics worked with quiet efficiency, tending to minor wounds and shock. Xenoan security teams moved in coordinated sweeps, securing the chamber with a grim professionalism. The glittering ceremony had shattered, replaced by the harsh reality of violence. People spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the exits. The mood had curdled from hope to raw fear. Advisors from both sides converged. Earth Command's lead envoy, his face pale, spoke first. He argued for an immediate postponement. A full security review was needed. A retreat to separate fortified locations. The risk was too great. His Xenoan counterpart, an elder with a severe face, nodded grimly. He echoed the sentiment. Their own hardliners would use this attack as proof of human duplicity. A pause was the only prudent course. Delay felt safe. It felt logical. It was the expected response. The path of least resistance. Empress Sailor watched the debate. Her composure was a rock in the turbulent room. The advisors' voices were a chorus of caution, urging a step back into the known territory of suspicion and separation. She listened, her face betraying nothing. Then she stood. She did not shout. She did not gesture. Her simple act of rising to her feet silenced the room more effectively than any command. All eyes turned to her. The air tightened. She spoke. Her voice was low, but it carried to every corner of the hall. It held the absolute authority of her station. She did not address the fear. She dismissed it. Postponement was not an option. Delay would hand a victory to the attackers. It would allow their violence to dictate the future. It would prove their hateful point that fear was stronger than hope. She would not let that happen. Her decision was a calculated act of defiance, a refusal to let extremists derail the progress they had made. Silence fell. It wasn't an absence of sound, but a presence, a tangible thing that pressed on the ears. The Empress's voice cut through it clean and sharp. She spoke the ancient ritual words. They echoed off the polished walls, each syllable a hammer strike in the quiet. The language was formal, its structure archaic. It spoke of bonds, of duty, of bloodlines, and promises that outlasted stars. Every gaze in the hall fixed on Michael. He felt the weight of it like a physical pressure. The Xenoans watched him, their large, dark eyes unblinking. His own delegation stood stiffly to the side. He could feel their tension from across the room. Their worry was a silent hum. Acceptance meant crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. It meant forever altering the path of his life. He would never again be just a soldier, just a diplomat. He would be something new, something undefined. The Empress finished the formal question. Her voice softened only a fraction, making the words more intimate, more terrible. Do you accept the sacred responsibility of co-guardian to Prince Eris? The question hung in the air between them. It seemed to suck all other sound from the hall. It was heavy with implication, with consequence. It was a door opening onto a future he had never imagined, a future of immense honor and unbearable risk, a future where his loyalty would be divided, his very identity reshaped. Michael's eyes found the prince. Eris stood beside his mother, small and straight-backed in his formal robes. His young face was solemn, but his gaze was steady, hopeful. It was the same look he had given Michael when he asked for a story under the binary stars. That simple, unguarded curiosity had started all of this. It had been the first thread of trust. In that suspended moment, Michael's mind did not race. It became very still. He did not think of strategy or politics. He thought of the dead, the faces of the men and women he had led, who had followed him into fire and never come out. He heard the old silence from Teti. They had fought and died for a border, for a line on a star chart. They had defended. They had held. This was different. This was not about defending a line. It was about building something on the other side of it. It was about creating a future where that line meant nothing. The lives lost in the war demanded more than a guarded truce. They demanded a reason, a purpose that made the sacrifice mean something more than just a pause before the next fight. This was that desperate moment, the moment a warrior was asked to lay down his identity, to put aside the only role he had known for 20 years, the protector, the defender, the killer. He was being asked to become a father, a guardian, a builder. It was the hardest choice he had ever faced. It required a courage different from the kind that charges a bunker. He looked from the prince's hopeful face to the empress's expectant one. He saw the future in that triangulation, a fragile, possible future. His voice, when it came, was quiet. It did not echo. It was firm, clear, and carried only to those who needed to hear it. There was no hesitation. No doubt. I accept both the honor and the responsibility it entails. The words were simple. Their meaning was not. He had chosen. He had chosen to protect a future, not just defend a border. He had chosen the child over the strategy, the promise over the policy. The silence in the hall broke, not with noise but with a collective release of breath. 100 Xenoan nobles let out a sound they did not know they were holding. The decision was made. The path was set. There was no turning back. The ceremony held none of the drawn-out ritual Michael expected. It was brief, ancient in its simplicity, physically intimate in a way that bypassed politics. The empress did not speak to the court. She did not read from a scroll or invoke long strings of titles. She simply stepped down from the dais and walked toward them. The silence in the hall deepened, becoming a thing you could feel against your skin. She stopped before her son and the human soldier. She placed one hand on her son's head, her long blue fingers resting gently on his crown. Her other hand came to rest on Michael's shoulder. The contact was firm, warm through the fabric of his formal uniform. Her touch was a current. It connected them, a circuit closing, a trio bound by a silent transmission of intent. They became a single unit in the eyes of the court, a living sculpture representing a fragile, audacious new hope. The empress, the heir, and the human guardian. The assembled Xenoan nobility remained utterly frozen. They were witnessing an event with no precedent in their entire recorded history. Their traditions stretched back millennia, filled with complex rites and symbolic gestures. But this was something new forged from something old. A human, a former enemy commander, was now irrevocably tied to the royal bloodline. He was no longer an ambassador or a diplomat. He was a father guardian. The title carried legal weight, cultural significance, and a duty that transcended species. The sacred ceremony that formally bound him was not a complex incantation or a bloody oath. It was a simple, deliberate touch. The empress's hand on the prince signified her trust, her blessing, the continuity of their line. Her hand on Michael's shoulder signified the transfer of that trust, the imposition of that duty, the acceptance of him into the circle of protection. It was a gesture that said, "This one is mine. He is yours now too. Protect what is mine." It was a language older than words. Michael felt the shift instantly, his role transformed in the space of that touch. The weight of Earth's diplomatic mission, the endless negotiation points, the strategic calculations, it all receded, becoming background noise. His primary duty was no longer to a government or a planet. It was to the boy standing beside him, This was no longer about negotiating terms of peace. It was about safeguarding a son. The political reality and the personal vow had fused into one inseparable thing. Any threat to the prince was now a threat to the peace, and his duty was to stand against it. The alliance between their peoples was no longer a document waiting for signatures. It was written in this moment in the silent space between three people. It was signed not on paper with ink but in flesh and promise. The Empress's hand was the seal. The court's stunned silence was the witness. Michael's acceptance of the touch, his stillness under her hand, was his signature. It was a contract of trust, and the penalty for breaking it was the loss of everything they were trying to build. He looked at the prince. The boy's large eyes looked back, serious and trusting. He looked at the Empress. Her gaze was unwavering, a ruler's assessment and a mother's hope combined. The political calculation was now a heartbeat. The strategic advantage was a breath. It was all personal now. Every decision he would make from this moment would be filtered through this new lens. Was it good for the boy? Did it keep him safe? Would it honor the trust placed in him by a child and a queen? The Empress removed her hands. The connection broke, but the bond remained etched into the air around them. The ceremony was over. It had taken less than a minute. There were no cheers, no celebratory music. Only the continued heavy silence of a court grappling with a new reality. Michael's world had just been cleaved in two. He had a foot in two civilizations, his loyalty anchored to a child who stood between them. He was Earth's man on Aralis Prime, but he was Eris's guardian first. The path ahead was unknown, but his first step on it was this: a silent promise to a boy under the touch of an alien queen. The work of diplomacy was finished. The work of guardianship had just begun. Peace is a fragile thing. It's most vulnerable right when you think you've got it. The ceremonial hall on Aralis Prime was packed. Delegates from Earth and Xenoan nobles stood side by side. The air hummed with translation devices and cautious hope. The formal opening statements were about to begin. This was the public declaration, the moment the ceasefire turned into an accord. It was supposed to be a celebration. Human extremists saw it differently. They saw it as a betrayal. These were men and women who had lost people in the war. They saw peace not as a victory but as surrender. They believed humans and Xenoans could never trust each other. They decided to prove it. This public ceremony was their last chance to stop it, to shatter the new alliance before it could take its first breath. 5 figures broke from the crowd. They moved fast with purpose. Their human faces were set in hard lines. They wore the uniforms of the Earth delegation's technical staff, but their hands held weapons. Compact energy pistols, a serrated ceramic knife. Their target was clear. Not the human diplomats. The Xenoan royal family. The Empress and her son protocol was clear. Michael's training screamed at him. Seek cover with the Earth delegation. Get behind the security detail. Let the professionals handle the threat. It was the smart move. The safe move. The move that kept an Earth diplomat alive to negotiate another day. He took half a step toward his own people. Michael felt the slip like a physical blow. His jaw tightened. He wanted to correct it, to explain it away as a simple error, but the moment had passed. The truth was out. His Xenoan, the language of his enemy, had betrayed him. It had reached into his memory and pulled out a piece of his trauma, presenting it to a child as part of a bedtime story. This was not a failure of diplomacy. It was something far more dangerous. It was an unintended moment of raw vulnerability. He had come to negotiate from a position of strength, or at least its illusion. Now he stood before them, his deepest grief accidentally on display. He had given them a weapon, a personal one. Prince Aris did not recoil. He did not look to his minders. He simply listened. His young mind parsed the emotion, not just the flawed words. He received the story of the Earth stars, but he also received the unspoken confession, hidden within it. The story of loss. The cost of the war measured in human pain. It was a gift, but a dangerous one. Not a calculated offering from a diplomat, but an involuntary truth from a soldier. It was the kind of honesty that could shatter negotiations or forge a connection no treaty could ever create. The Xenoan court held its breath, waiting to see which it would be. Michael looked at the child, then at the silent, watching nobles. He had not meant to show them this. He had meant to be careful, precise, controlled. Instead, he had given them a piece of himself, a piece he thought was buried too deep to ever see light again. The binary stars continued their slow dance outside the window. indifferent to the fragile human moment unfolding in their light. The bridge between them, built on a child's curiosity, had just been tested by a soldier's grief. It held, but it was different now, stronger and far more fragile. Xenoan customs did not follow human logic. Their social codes were a maze of unspoken rules. Ambassador Ellis had briefed Michael on this. He said the Xenoans valued subtlety over directness, implication over statement. One wrong gesture, one misplaced word, and years of work could collapse. The tension was a constant hum in the background of every meeting, every exchange. This was not a battlefield with clear lines and known risks. It was a cultural minefield, and Michael was walking through it blind. The Empress summoned him after the observation deck incident. The private briefing room was smaller than the court chambers, the walls lined with glowing data crystals instead of carved histories. She stood by a view screen showing the binary stars, her back to him for a long moment. When she turned, her expression was unreadable, but her posture was that of a ruler delivering a vital truth, not a diplomat offering a concession. She spoke in clear, measured galactic common. "Commander Rains, you have interacted with my son." It was not a question. Michael nodded, waiting. He prepared for a reprimand, a warning to maintain distance. Instead, she offered an explanation, a key to understanding the lock he was trying to pick. "In our culture," she stated, her voice devoid of sentiment, "the word of a child is sacred." The sentence hung in the air, simple and absolute. Michael processed it. This was not a vague principle or a polite ideal. It was a foundational pillar of their entire society, as concrete and enforceable as any law. A child's pure observation, untainted by political ambition or adult deception, carried an immense, undeniable weight. Their honesty was considered the closest thing to objective truth their species could achieve. This belief was ancient, rooted in a philosophical tradition that viewed childhood not as a stage of ignorance, but of clarity. Xenoans held that children perceive the world without the filters of prejudice, agenda, or fear. They see what is, not what they are told to see or what they wish to see. They learn deceit later from adults. Therefore, a child's unfiltered word was not just heard. It was absorbed into the political and social fabric. It could validate or invalidate an adult's claims, shift alliances, and alter policy. It was a checks and balances system built on innocence. Prince Eris's declaration to his mother about the human delegate was therefore not a casual comment from a curious boy. It was a formal, culturally significant event. He had observed Michael. He had spoken of his attempt to speak their language, of the story he tried to tell, of the raw emotion that had accidentally bled through his flawed words. The prince had attributed these things to respect and honesty, qualities he perceived directly, without the filter of his species' collective memory of war. He had spoken of an enemy soldier with a regard rarely afforded to outsiders. And in doing so, according to the deepest tenets of his culture, his word became law. His assessment was not a suggestion for the Empress to consider. It was a truth for her to act upon. She was bound by tradition and belief to trust her son's uncorrupted judgment absolutely. The human was not what their intelligence report said. He was what her son said he was. That changed everything. The private briefing was not a scolding. It was a translation of a seismic shift that Michael, in his ignorance, had already caused. The child had built the bridge. Now the adults had to decide if they would cross it. The Empress watched Michael, her dark eyes calculating the ramifications of a truth she was obligated to accept. The Empress stood before her strategic council, the holographic star charts of human and Xenoan space glowing between them. Her advisors argued for measured steps, for containment policies, for a peace built on suspicion and verified by mutual deterrence. Their voices were the practiced hum of statecraft. But her mind was not on the star maps. It was on a single moment in an observation room. Her son's face lit by alien starlight as he spoke of the human soldier. Her son's sacred word had forced a shift in her perception. It was a key turning a lock deep inside her. She no longer saw Commander Rains as a human, a species, an abstract enemy. She saw him as her son had. A person, a man who carried his losses in his posture, who tried to speak their tongue despite the pain it clearly evoked. A soldier whose first instinct with her child was not threat but story. The trust her son placed in that weary, scarred human was absolute, and by the oldest law of her people she was bound to honor that trust. Her head advisor, An elder with skin like weathered blue stone spoke the fear in the room. To integrate a frontline enemy commander into the royal bloodline is not boldness. It is madness. The other council members murmured agreement. Their faces were masks of aristocratic alarm. They saw only the risk. A Trojan horse welcomed into their most sacred sanctum. A killer given access to their future king. The Empress saw further. She saw the strategic value shimmering like a mirage beyond the immediate danger. A human co-guardian for the Xenoan heir. The symbolism was staggering. It would be the most powerful signal of peace imaginable. A statement written not in treaty clauses but in blood and trust. It would show her people and his that the future could be built on something stronger than mutually assured destruction. It would be a living shield for the peace more potent than any fleet. But it was not just strategy. She looked past the advisors, her gaze finding the window and the stars beyond. She saw the personal trust. Her son, a perceptive child raised in a gilded cage of protocol, had reached out and found an unexpected honesty. He had seen something worth believing in. To dismiss that, to prioritize political caution over her child's clear-eyed judgment, would be a deeper betrayal than any an enemy could commit. She was a ruler, but she was a mother first. Her son's word was sacred. His safety was her paramount concern, and he had chosen his protector. The proposal took shape in her mind, audacious and terrifying. Not an adoption in the human sense, but the granting of a formal Xenoan title, father guardian. It was a role from their oldest traditions rarely invoked, a chosen protector bound to the royal heir by oath and ceremony, granted immense authority and unconditional responsibility. It was a fusion of family and statecraft that had no parallel in human diplomacy. This would be beyond negotiation. It would be an integration, turning a personal bond, sparked by a child's question, into a political reality. The risk was monumental. It placed the heir to the Xenoan Empire in the hands of a man who had once orchestrated attacks against them. It invited outrage from their own hardliners and suspicion from Earth's. It was a gambit that could shatter the fragile peace in a single, catastrophic betrayal. The potential reward was the only thing that made the risk tolerable. A bond no treaty could ever create. An alliance sealed not with signatures but with a vow. A promise from a warrior to a child that would be stronger than any border, any fleet, any history of war. It was a chance to build something new from the ashes of the old, and it began with a mother trusting her son's judgment of a stranger's heart. She turned from the star charts, her decision made. The council fell silent, reading her resolve. The unthinkable was now their only path forward. The Empress did not make the offer in secret. She brought it before the entire Xenoan court. The great hall felt larger than space itself, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. The assembled nobles stood in perfect rows, their ceremonial silks a sea of shifting blues and silvers. Their faces were stone. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and cold metal. The alien prince approached me at the observation window. His blue skin shimmered under the starlight as he spoke in careful Xenoan. "You speak our language." Then he asked for an Earthstar story. In that moment I realized this child might hold the key to peace that decades of diplomacy failed to achieve. Commander Michael Rains moved through the Xenoan halls with a soldier's awareness. He carried the weight of 2 brutal campaigns in his shoulders. His stance, the slight dip to his left side where the prosthetic arm connected. The silver hand didn't just replace what was lost at Teddy. It stood for every soldier who never made it home. He felt their absence like a constant hollow pressure in his chest. Earth Command sent a warrior to negotiate peace. The contradiction wasn't lost on the Xenoans. Their officials watched him from alcoves, their multi-jointed fingers tracing the ceremonial sashes across their chests. Their distrust was a living thing in the room, cold and sharp. Michael knew their suspicion. He had once been the reason for it. His mission on Aralis Prime was clear. Translate a fragile ceasefire into something that lasted. Not just a pause in the killing, but a real end. The initial terms were set. The hard part started now. He spoke their language with a battlefield accent. He knew the words for attack formations, for surrender, for medevac. He'd learned them from intercepted transmissions and dying whispers over comms. This was different. This required words for culture, for trust, for tomorrow. He remembered the silence after the Tahiti bombardment most. Not the explosion itself, but the dead air after. The void where friends once responded to check-ins. That silence lived in him now. He entered the alien court armed only with memory and a thin strand of hope. The Zenoan throne room stretched high above him, its walls carved with histories he couldn't read. Every gesture here meant something. The angle of a head, the placement of hands, the timing of a response, each could be an offense. Each could undo everything. He accepted this mission because the dead deserved more than a temporary truce. They deserved a reason for their sacrifice, a future where their children wouldn't have to fight the same war. That belief was the only weapon he brought. The Zenoan nobles watched his every step. Their large dark eyes missed nothing. They saw the way his prosthetic hand sometimes hesitated before touching a surface. They noted how his gaze scanned exits and assessed threats even here, in their most secure chamber. They knew a soldier when they saw one. His presence was a gamble. Earth Command debated it for weeks, sending the man who led the assault on their northern colonies to beg for peace. It was either madness or genius. There was no middle ground. The stakes were the entire future of two civilizations. Not just trade agreements or borderlines. Whether they would keep spending their youth in trenches and starships, burying another generation, or whether they could find another way. Michael felt the weight of it in the ache of his shoulder, in the phantom pain of a hand that wasn't there. He looked at the Zenoan High Council, their faces unreadable. They saw an enemy in their midst. He had to make them see a partner. The work would be slow. It would require patience he wasn't sure he had. But he remembered the silence. And he knew he would do anything to keep it from growing. The observation window showed two suns, one gold, one violet, locked in an endless dance. This binary system marked neutral space, the only ground both sides would agree to meet on. The stars burned cold and distant, making human worries feel small. Michael stood apart from the other delegates. He watched the light play across the Zenoan architecture, noting sight lines, potential cover, the way sound carried, old habits. The Zenoan royal party moved through the chamber with practiced grace, their blue skin catching the starlight. Prince Eris slipped his handlers. He moved with a child's quick, uncalculated steps, breaking formation. His two adult minders stiffened but didn't follow. Protocol demanded distance. The child ignored it. He walked straight toward the human delegate. The air in the room went still. Michael felt the shift. Every Zenoan noble watched the breach. A wrong move now could end everything. Months of negotiation. Gone in a child's moment of curiosity. Michael kept his posture open, his hands visible. He didn't move. The prince stopped an arm's length away. His large dark eyes looked up, unblinking. He spoke in clear, formal Zenoan. The words were perfect, the tone respectful. "You speak our language," Michael answered in the same tongue. His accent was rough, his grammar serviceable but blunt. He lacked the subtle tonal shifts that gave the language its grace. He sounded like what he was. A soldier who learned from intercepts and prisoners. "I have studied it." The prince's head tilted. He didn't comment on the errors. He heard the effort instead of the mistakes. The respect in the attempt. Then he asked the question that changed everything. His voice lost its formality, becoming a child's genuine curiosity. "Will you tell me one Earth Star story?" It wasn't diplomacy. It wasn't strategy. It was a boy asking for a bedtime tale under alien suns. The request hung between them, simple and profound. Michael looked at the child, not the prince. He saw past the royal silks, the ceremonial markings. He saw a young mind reaching across a gulf of war and mistrust. The adults in the room watched with guarded faces, their thoughts locked behind diplomatic masks. This child had no such armor. His curiosity was raw and open. In that moment, Michael understood. The key to peace wasn't in the negotiation chamber. It wasn't in trade agreements or border charts. It was here, in a child's question. The prince had seen past the uniform, past the scars, past the history. He saw a person who might know a good story. The formal talks had built walls. This built a bridge. It was fragile, untested, made of nothing but words and curiosity. But it was more than they had managed in years of structured meetings. Michael glanced at the Zenoan nobles. Their faces were unreadable, but their stillness spoke volumes. They waited to see how the human would handle this breach. Whether he would use it, dismiss it, or worse, offend. He looked back at the prince. The binary stars cast twin shadows across the floor. He chose his next words with more care than any treaty clause. This wasn't about politics. It was about connection. The first real one they'd made. He began to speak, his accented Zenoan filling the quiet space between them. He told of Earth's constellations, of myths older than spaceflight. The prince listened, his head tilted, absorbing every imperfect word. The bridge held. Michael's Xenoan was not the language of courts or poetry. He learned it from intercepts, from battlefield chatter, from the screams of wounded soldiers on both sides. He knew the words for ambush, for surrender, for medical evacuation. He knew how to say hold your fire and cease engagement. The grammar of conflict was familiar ground. The grammar of stories was foreign territory. He tried to tell the prince about Orion, the hunter, the belt of 3 stars. His Xenoan was clumsy. He fumbled for terms, his sentences full of gaps where the right words should be. He described the stars not as they were in myth, but as he had seen them from the viewport of a gunship. Landmarks for navigation, targets for orbital strikes. The story came out wrong, harsh and functional. He reached for the word twinkling, a simple concept, a child's word in any language. His mind, trained for a different kind of communication, offered him a different term. One he had heard in after-action reports, one that described not the gentle light of a star, but the final static-filled transmission from a ship that had just been hit. It meant irreparable loss, the permanent silence after a catastrophic event. He said that word. The air in the observation room changed. The Xenoan nobles shifted almost imperceptibly. Their large dark eyes narrowed. The mistake was not just linguistic. It was emotional. It was a window into a place Michael kept sealed. The prince's gaze fixed on him. The child's playful curiosity vanished, replaced by a startling depth of perception. He did not hear a mispronunciation. He heard the weight behind the error. He heard the sorrow embedded in the syllable. He was a child of a royal house, trained to read nuance, to hear the truth behind formal words. He heard it now in this clumsy human story.